That is how she learns to behave. Those 6 words landed in the dining room like a dropped plate. They were small, precise, proud, the kind of sentence that is comfortable in the mouths of people who think power is earned by inflicting pain. Helen said them with a slow, satisfied clap. Her palms hadn't made much sound. It was the intent behind the gesture that echoed. Ariana flinched before I even saw the mark. There was the hollow, animal pause that happens right after a hand connects, time collapsing to the size of a breath. The crystal glass trembled where Mark's fist had sent it, a resounding ping across the table. My fork scraped my plate. The sound was ridiculous and obscene against the sudden hush. For 30 seconds, the room existed only in small noises, the heating vent sighing, the soft scrape of chair legs, Helen's discouraged little laugh that somehow made the world tilt. It was the 3rd slap. 3 precise strikes. Not an accident, not a misguided moment. Deliberate. Slow enough for the rest of us to understand its lesson. I had been trained to notice escalation. I knew the anatomy of control, how it starts with a joke that becomes a critique, how it migrates from sarcasm to silence, how 1,000 tiny corrections lay the foundation for a single decisive blow. But I was a mother first. My brain moved on 2 tracks, the instinct that surged toward Ariana and the legal mind that already, without conscious permission, began cataloging what had just happened. I picked up my phone. I did not run across the room. I did not yell. I put my thumb on the number that had been on speed dial for 12 years, Commander Miller. He had been a friend of Robert's during his final campaign. He respected me, and, if the past counted for anything, he respected the law. I pulled the phone to speaker and set it on the sideboard where the call could be heard by everyone, transparent, public, recorded, in the way presence can make wrongdoing harder to misrepresent. When people ask me why I didn't physically restrain Mark, why I didn't throw coffee at him or upend the table, I tell them it was not shock. It was calculation. I did not want to add assault to an already dangerous cocktail of facts. I wanted an official record. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the moment marked by other people's ears and memory. In our jurisdiction, the presence of an impartial responding officer and contemporaneous recording matter. That is not because the law is perfect. It is because evidence is the language courts understand. Commander Miller, I said, my voice steady because I had to make it so. This is Elena Vance. I'm at my home, 417 South Hollow. My daughter has just been struck by her husband. I'm putting you on speaker. There was a hum of acknowledgement on the other end, a professional intake of breath like someone dipping their hand into cold water. I heard him ask the usual triage questions, names, immediate danger, whether anyone was armed. I answered. I described the slap. I mentioned Helen's applause. I asked for an officer to be dispatched. I asked that they keep their energy steady. We wanted neutral witnesses, not escalation. Putting the call on speaker was both strategy and statement. It told everyone in the room that the event had been witnessed by someone outside. It also took the heat off my shoulders. That, more than anything, is why abusers count on private spaces. Their cruelty depends on silence. I refuse to give them silence. Mark understood the cost of that move. He had rehearsed consequences like perfume. He always smelled of them. He lunged toward the phone once, an ugly, fast reach. I held my hand flat on the top of the device. Elena, the mother, pushed against Mark, the husband's hand. Elena, the lawyer, glared. For me, those identities have never been opposites. They've been different instruments played in the same orchestration. An officer arrived 22 minutes later, Commander Miller's team. In my mind, the minutes rearranged themselves into more menacing shapes. There was the way Mark's face tightened into practiced indignation, the neat cruelty of Helen's smile as she translated her pride into a performance for the room, Ariana's small, shocked sound like a broken chord. I remember the officer's tape recorder, an old habit of mine, to always notice whether the police would be documenting. He wrote his notes in a tight, slanted hand. He took my statement, Ariana's statement. We sat together on the couch while she wrapped a napkin around her wrist, and Helen's loud theatrical proclamation that it was the daughter who had provoked the corrective measure. Mark swore, as abusers do, that he'd barely touched her. The arrest came that night, not immediately, but with the procedural machinery set in motion. Mark was taken on an assault charge with a protective hold placed against him. Helen followed the officers to the driveway with a face like a masquerade. "You made a big mistake," she told me, as if I had simply misread a menu and ordered the wrong thing. "You can't ruin us." That was the moment the war began, though at the time I thought it began simply because a man had struck his wife. In truth, it began because a woman I barely knew had decided her son would never answer for anything without the rest of the family being prepared to burn what they could to keep him free. If I had not been a family law attorney, that night would have been different in ways that matter and ways that do not. I would have been the hysterical mother at the police station. I would have been the shaken woman who calls friends and cries. Instead, I filled forms, I wrote a precise affidavit that mapped the scene. Dates, times, words spoken, the number of slaps. And I requested an emergency protective order for Ariana. The order was granted for the initial period. The police file became part of a stack of institutional steps that, if they worked as they are designed, create a thin shield around people in danger. This is the hard and simple truth. Law can stop one moment. It can't always fix patterns. It can stop a night, but not necessarily a campaign. And Helen Harrison knew that better than most. Before I get too far ahead, let me give you a moment to breathe in with me. If this story is hitting something close to home, write the name of your city in the comments. It helps me know where this is happening, that these things aren't just anecdotes in a single distant household. It helps other viewers understand this problem isn't private, it is everywhere. Ariana had been my compass long before she became its most battered point. She was the child who insisted I slow down at red foxes on country roads. She kept bits of twine and stones in her pockets like little relics. Sundays were ours. Robert's roast and his jokes that always missed the mark and made us laugh because of that. Robert was the quiet center of our small cathedral of rituals. He had the kind of patience that teachers envy. He taught Ariana to read in the red summer light of our porch, and he tucked notes inside her lunchboxes when she began chemical engineering, because he thought that was what made her eyes light up. Those Sundays mattered. They were small muscles in my life that kept me steady. In those rooms, we taught each other how to love gently. I tell you that not to evoke nostalgia, but because it is important to know what kind of life existed before Mark slid into it, both to mark the difference and to explain why I had let certain things go for so long. I met Mark at a symposium on corporate governance. He was tall, worked for a firm that advised on compliance, and drank his coffee black as an accusation. He smiled like the rest of the room owed him attention. He had a sonorous laugh and a habit of naming other people's strengths as if they were his own. At first, he was charming in a practiced way. He complimented my work without knowing too much about it. He made me feel visible. There is an art to seduction that can seem like admiration. We invited him and Helen to dinner because my life had room for new people. We trusted our instincts about character, and we were wrong. The red flags didn't arrive as fireworks. They came like seams unstitched. He corrected Ariana's wardrobe in front of friends. He sent messages that read like tests. He asked small, seemingly reasonable things. Could she work from home more often? Could she leave early from a project because he missed dinner? Each request had a tiny etiquette of normalcy. Each yielded a little more isolation. Helen was the slow rot, the woman who perfected triangulation. She turned social advice into moral law and punished everyone who disagreed with silence and smirk. She had stories about her son that framed him as both fragile and specially chosen. She insisted the family had to circle the wagons around him. When you live in a household that privileges pride over accountability, you learn to minimize the mildest of offenses. But inside those small silences, a pattern forms. The first time Mark raised a hand to Ariana in a way that left a mark, we treated it as a mistake. He apologized, left flowers, promised counseling. We let it reside in the category of a flaw we can correct. I know now that phrase is dangerous. It buys time for the next blow. When I represented clients over the years, parents who had struggled to get protection for their children, women whose injuries were minimized in emergency room notes, I learned the importance of building a paper trail. The law is procedural. It answers to dates, photographs, contemporaneous records, and credible testimony. Evidence beats eloquence in court. That is why the night of the slaps, the phone on speaker mattered. That is why I wrote out a timeline of small incidents stretching back 2 years. The nights she arrived home late from work and Mark's texts, the canceled dinners, the subtle economic pressure he applied in asking her to shift her retirement contributions for simplicity. Those things read like trivia if you pluck them out. When aligned, they look like a pattern. I want to be very clear about language here. I do not say abuse to make dramatic claims. I use it because the pattern matches the dictionary and the lived reality: coercive control, threats, isolation, and then physical harm. There are behaviors that function as prelude, and there are behaviors that constitute harm. When both exist, the risk multiplies. If you are hearing this as someone who has felt these small erosions, you are not alone. The escalation follows an arc: honeymoon, fracture, entrenchment, violence, if you let it. With Mark, the honeymoon lasted unusually long. He put on a patient mask, a fatherly charm that made it hard to reconcile him with the man who struck. He charmed colleagues and neighbors. He volunteered at the community center. He posted pictures of Ariana at graduations with captions that read like poetry. People who judge from the outside could not see the ledger of small cruelties added up over time. Most abusers are experts at public face. They use it to argue disbelief. They will read the court of public opinion like a manual and invest in impressions. Helen, for all her theatrics, was a strategist. She understood that if you control narrative, you can muddy truth. That would become important later when the first attempts at destroying our reputations began. There were moments when I believed Mark could change. I wanted to believe it because the alternative is to admit that a person I had welcomed into my daughter's life was dangerous. Some of you will understand the paralysis of that calculus, the desire to preserve family, the disbelief that someone you like could be a threat. Trust is a stubborn habit. The first time I took an official client to trial, I was 28. It was a custody matter that pivoted on parental fitness. The opposing counsel had a gallery of witnesses who painted my client as inconsistent. I sat on my hands until the right moment, and then, because I'd studied not just the law, but the way people behave when they are safe, I produced an old voicemail from the parent that revealed the pattern of manipulation that had been denied. The jury's faces changed when they listened. The case taught me the power of contemporaneous evidence. A recording, a text, a photograph can make the movement of years comprehensible in 20 minutes. That teaching echoed in my actions when Mark struck Ariana. We gathered what we could. We photographed the marks discreetly. We recorded contemporaneous notes. We had friends' text messages that could verify other incidents. We asked for hospital notes if medical attention was sought. All of those things would sit in an evidence file that later became a weapon for protection. But the Harrison family had resources. Wealth is not a crime, but it buys influence. They retained a public relations firm whose job was to make contradictions smell like nuance. They had a cousin who knew people at the paper. They knew magistrates who moved in polite circles and would speak for their character if asked. That network would slow us down and weaponize normality into an argument for disbelief. How could a family like that be violent? They started where these things always do, by insisting on alternative narratives. Within days of the arrest, a polished memorandum began circulating, anonymous op-eds that suggested Ariana had provoked Mark, carefully curated social media posts about difficult marriages, and a smear piece that portrayed me as an adversarial mother eager to control my daughter's life. They framed Ariana as the unstable party. They framed Mark as a man crushed by public accusation. People are more likely to believe a plausible narrative than an improbable truth. So the family invested in plausibility. They published photos of Mark at charity events. They sponsored a soft profile in a lifestyle magazine that mentioned his tough childhood and suggested empathy for a complex man. It was relentless and slow and meant to fray the edges of public sympathy. That campaign began to chip at our support. Friends slowed their calls, colleagues offered muted encouragement, and even some relatives hesitated to show up at hearings for fear of being dragged into a spectacle. Those small betrayals feel enormous. They are not just social slights, they are tactical moves in a campaign to isolate. When community support withdraws, the person in danger faces a loneliness that is as dangerous as any bruise. Our first legal response was predictable and, I thought at the time, strategically sound. We fought for the restraining order to be extended. We sought a preliminary injunction against any defamatory publications that could jeopardize Ariana's safety. We demanded that the PR campaign be taken down or retracted. We prepared discovery requests for financial records that might illuminate the Harrisons' willingness to use power. We also contacted the Bar Association when statements began to impugn my professional conduct and attempt to attack me that smacked of intimidation. There are 200 forms one must learn to love when pushing back against a well-resourced opponent. You learn to file with the patience of someone turning tiles in a mosaic, each motion placed with care, each exhibit labeled, each deposition scheduled. The law is a long war of attrition. It rewards meticulousness and stamina. I had both. But the Harrisons had something else, momentum and the willingness to press beyond the bounds of respectable combat. They investigated our background relentlessly. They circulated allegations about unpaid taxes, insubstantial but messy. They filed a professional complaint with the state bar suggesting that I had been manipulating my daughter. They used private investigators to shadow Ariana. A few of our neighbors received anonymous letters suggesting that the Vances were not the family we had appeared to be. There are times when the work is purely legal and times when it is a different kind of defense. A defense of memory, of narrative, of the right to be believed. When the war turned toward reputation, my role as a lawyer morphed into guardianship of truth. It taught me that evidence in the courtroom is only part of the struggle. Evidence in the court of public life matters too. A lesson I learned years ago in another high-stakes custody fight came back to me then. You have to think 2 moves ahead. In that prior case, opposing counsel had tried to bury a favorable piece of evidence by leaking an irrelevant family squabble to a friendly reporter. We responded by preemptively releasing a statement with the full context, forcing the narrative into public air where we could correct it. It bought us time. It also revealed an ugly fact. If you don't control the narrative, others will, and they will use any tool to win. The Harrisons controlled narrative the way some people collect stamps. They had influence in municipal circles and friends at the paper. Within a week, we were in a flurry of reaction papers, defense statements, and damage control. We began to lose small battles. A magistrate who had once been sympathetic was reassigned and replaced by one rumored to be connected to a Harrison donor. In our jurisdiction, such connections matter. Judges are human. They are susceptible to social networks and quiet pressures. I do not say this to complain about the judiciary. We had seen grand acts of integrity in courts before, but to paint an honest picture of how the system we relied on could be strained by social capital. Ariana weathered the early days the way many survivors do, with an odd mixture of fury and self-doubt. She took to walking late at night, learning the city by its lamplight. She applied for new positions, focusing on things that would give her financial independence. There were nights when she'd cry in the shower, where the water hid the shape of the tears. There were other nights when she'd pack small boxes of her things and whisper at the cardboard like it might hear. I would sit in the kitchen holding a mug that cooled too fast and remember Robert's hand on my shoulder, steady, reassuring, and wonder what he would have done. We went to hearings. I watched Ariana testifying, steady and brave in a way that made my chest ache. She described the slaps and the jokes and the isolation with the precision of a scientist, cataloging events and responses. Her voice sometimes quavered. I saw juror-like faces in the audience of family court, glances that measure and weigh. In the corridors after testimony, Mark's team circulated an insinuating memo about her professionalism, trying to turn her workplace against her. They would later file an expensive defamation suit designed not only to punish but to bleed our resources. That decision, an expensive countersuit, was the Harrison playbook. They weren't interested in a clean legal win so much as a campaign to exhaust us. Litigation is a cost game. Wealth buys attrition. They sought to drive us into settlement through exhaustion, to make the continued fight materially and psychologically unbearable. Early on, I felt a distinct sense of siege. Threats, overt and veiled, came in the forms of letters, veiled calls to employers, and anonymous tips about Ariana posted under the light of night on community forums. My assistant Lucy, practical and unsentimental, urged fortification. Change passwords, limit social media, hire a security expert. We did. The costs accrued. The hours took their toll on my practice. Clients texted with the tentative language of people who didn't want to be sucked into drama. Some withdrew from social events. The Harrisons had successfully made association with us controversial. There is a vicious economy to this kind of pressure. For powerful families, litigation and the manipulation of reputation are tools of governance. For those on the receiving end, the cost is integrity, energy, and sometimes livelihood. It is in that stretch between the night of the arrest and the moment when evidence shifts the axis of truth that many people give up. They fold because the price of going on seems too high. I thought about that a lot. I thought about what it would mean to step back, to accept a quiet life for my daughter, and to let the Harrisons have their public image. I thought about Robert, who would have hated the idea of our days becoming litigation. I thought about the ethical contours of being a litigator mother, how much of my professional drive was protective, and how much stroked the old muscle of winning. Then came the next series of moves. Mark's attorney filed for a temporary suspension of the protective order on a procedural ground. It was a technical argument, hinging on a clerk's tiny signature, and it worked its way to a magistrate who, for reasons I could only speculate, found the procedural lapse plausible. In our jurisdiction, such things can happen. They terrify you because they demonstrate how fragile protective structures can be in the face of legal maneuvering. When the temporary suspension went through, the Harrison social apparatus turned the moment into proof of rehabilitation. See, the narrative said, the law reversed itself. He cannot be so bad. We watched incredulously as social media amplified that reading. It was as if the world wanted to prefer a tidy story to the messy truth of escalation and control. At that point, the fight felt less like a legal contest and more like a lesson in what power does well. It pushes the story toward what benefits the privileged. That knowledge is not new, it is ancient, but knowing it and living it are different things. And yet, there were corners of light. Commander Miller, who had put his team on the case that first night, did not blink when we asked for further protection. He was precise and stubborn, the sort of officer who keeps lists and follows up on them. Lucy, my assistant, moved like a small hurricane, keeping schedules, sending emails, arranging meetings with therapists and mediators. Ariana, sleepless and furious, began to write down every interaction with the Harrisons. She learned in short order the value of her own record. I want to pause and say this to anyone listening. Record what you can safely record. A contemporaneous note is not a betrayal, it is a tool. When I suggest that, I am describing an action I took, not issuing a universal prescription. Each life has boundaries and risks, and you should measure them carefully. The first months felt like winter. The headlines, subtle, damning, arranged themselves like frost. Our support system thinned, but inside our home there were small rebellions of normalcy. Ariana teaching me the new recipe she had learned at her job, Lucy dropping by with a box of warm scones, my own clients sending notes of encouragement. Those small gestures matter as currency when everything else costs. And yet, the Harrisons kept pressing. Their attacks broadened. An anonymous complaint to the IRS came and was followed by a glossy, anonymous letter circulated among my professional contacts alleging ethical lapses. It was a slow drip campaign designed to corrode. Each new salvo required a tangential response: audit counsel, clarifying statements, reputational triage. They were trying to make the tree of our lives look diseased from a distance. It is hard to convey the texture of exhaustion that sets in when the fight becomes about everything. You spend energy anticipating new attacks. You hire teams to respond to permutations you cannot imagine. Your phone becomes both a lifeline and an instrument of invasion. You learn to compartmentalize grief and to ration outrage. And you discover a deep, uncanny reservoir of endurance you did not know you possessed. By the time we had our first meaningful hearing, one where a judge would hear arguments about the restraining order's continuance, the case file was thick, exhibits lined up like dominoes, testimony from neighbors, statements from coworkers, medical notes. Each piece had to be argued into admissibility. Each context had to be explained. The Harrisons' counsel was aggressive but polished. They leaned on the family name as if it should absolve their client of the ordinary consequences of violence. I remember the morning of that hearing clearly. The sky was low, a bruised blue. I put on the suit Robert had given me when I passed the bar. It was a small talisman. Ariana held my hand in the parking lot and squeezed, a signal to me that in the dark of this process, she still trusted my judgment. In court, we walked through the sequence of events again. The 3 slaps, Helen's applause, the speakerphone call, the officer's notes. The magistrate listened, weighing our request against the Harrisons' counter-narrative. When the judge issued a narrow extension of the protective order, it felt like a small victory. But it was not a victory over the campaign. It was merely the next step in a long march. That night, as we sat at a small kitchen table with the courthouse sandwich we had picked up on the way home, Ariana and I promised each other that we would not let the Harrisons' war define the totality of our lives. We would protect what could be protected and try to live what could be lived. We did not know then that the campaign would soon escalate into something that would reopen old wounds buried in the Harrison family history, wounds that would eventually shift the axis of everything we had been fighting for. We did not know that an anonymous package would be the hinge on which the next chapter would swing. We did know only the immediate fact. The night that began with 3 slaps had turned family dinners into evidence, and every polite smile in their photographs had become a potential lie. It is a curious thing. You can live beside someone for years and still be surprised by what they are, by the way a hand can deliver more than a physical strike, by the way a woman's proud clap can function as encouragement for cruelty. That night taught me about the thinness of the veneer of civility and the speed at which it can be shredded. It also taught me something else. When you refuse silence, you begin to invite consequences you cannot fully predict. Some of those consequences will alter lives for the better. Some will be ruinous and slow. We went to bed that night exhausted and vigilant, not knowing that the Harrisons' next move would be a package left at a police station, a package that would make the war bigger, messier, and far more consequential than any of us could have imagined. And that was when the first real tremor of something larger started to run through the case, a tremor I could not yet name, but would come to recognize as the beginning of a closure none of us had expected. The package arrived 2 weeks after the magistrate's narrow, anxious extension of the protective order. It came in the middle of a gray Tuesday, wet sidewalks, a steady drizzle that made everything seem hesitant. Commander Miller called me that morning about a routine follow-up, a neighbor's statement, another security camera angle. He sounded like a man who had just had enough coffee to keep his patience and not his temper. "Elena," he said, "we've got something at the evidence locker. Someone dropped off a box this morning at Central, no return address. Albert Harrison signed for it under an alias, but the forensics tech flagged it. Can you come down?" I told him we'd be there in 20 minutes. I asked no questions on the phone. There is a discipline to not read implications into the tone of good news. At the station, the fluorescent lights hummed above us, and the evidence tech, young, careful, unrolled latex gloves like prayer flags. We all watched as he opened the box. Inside were files stacked with the quiet violence of paper, medical records, a thin envelope of photocopied letters between Helen and an unknown correspondent, receipts for services that did not match the Harrisons' ostensible expenditures, and then, on top, as if intended for maximum damage, 2 small, unremarkable digital recorders and a burned CD labeled in a shaky hand, Family Talks, 2010 to 2018. My stomach dropped to the bottom of my ribs the way it always did when a case pivoted from supposition into documented fact. The technicians cataloged, photographed, and logged each item. Commander Miller, who had the advantage of being precisely the kind of cop who keeps checklists the way some people keep photographs, read the log aloud so the chain of custody began on record. Date, time, condition of packaging, identifying marks. That record would become crucial because anonymous evidence, unaccompanied by proper seizure and documentation, can be worthless in a court where procedure matters almost as much as truth. We took the recorders to the forensic lab. The first playback was not cinematic. It was voice, breath, a household in the background, clinking plates, a radio playing faintly, someone humming off-key. Then Helen's voice, familiar to me now from the dinner table, but stripped of performance, came through, low and sharp. "I told him what would happen if he didn't keep the story straight," she said in one clip. "We had to make sure the narrative worked. People forgive men like Mark. They do not forgive messy women." There were other snippets. Helen coordinating with a woman who matched the voice of Christine Davis, talking about soft launches into publications, the placement of a sympathetic article, the timing of a philanthropic event to shift focus. But one clip, recorded in what sounded like a car in the middle of the night, stopped my breath. "It was Ray," Helen said, unusually steady. "He shouldn't have been there. It had to be done. Mark couldn't have his father. He was always—" She paused, the click of a cigarette lighter in the background. "He was going to ruin him. We did what we had to do. You understand?" The rest of the audio was a tangle of boasting and practicalities. who had access to the house the night Ray died, which medications were recorded as missing, a suggestion that a med tech might misfile an entry. The voice on the other end laughed and said, "Nobody will ever know. We bury it in the noise." I set the player down and felt my hands go light. I am not given to melodrama. The legal mind compartmentalizes and repurposes. But there was a personal vertigo there too, an astonishment that a woman who had applauded her son's violence could speak of disposal as a tactic and then laugh. Commander Miller and his captain moved with necessary caution. They began the work of treating the package not as a deus ex machina, but as evidence that required corroboration. They secured search warrants where applicable, interviewed lab techs, and asked for follow-up on medical records mentioned in the files. They requested an audio forensic analysis to authenticate voices and to check for edits. Because the package had been physically delivered to the station and logged by evidence techs, the recordings could be examined as seized material rather than contraband, which improved their prospects for admissibility. That did not make it simple. The defense raised predictably fierce objections. The record's provenance was anonymous. The recordings could be edited. The chain of events could be manufactured. We expected that, and we planned for it. The difference between a bombshell and something judges dismiss as purported is preparation and corroboration. Albert Harrison's name surfaced quickly after the initial forensic review. He had signed a receipt for the package under the alias. Surveillance footage showed his figure at a postal drop-off near his property. When detectives presented the evidence to him, he did not have long to compose denial. He was 22, drawn and remote, and he kept returning to one phrase, "I couldn't live with it anymore." His decision to step forward, first to officers, later before a grand jury, was a turning point not only for the case, but for him. In the weeks that followed, he told a story about guilt and small betrayals adding up. The sight of his aunt's soft clapping at a dinner table, the way stories about his Uncle Ray shifted in retelling, the moments he had laughed at jokes he later realized were cruel. He described watching his family groom public perception and feeling like an accessory to a lie. Albert provided two things that the anonymous package could not: a living witness who could be cross-examined and a chronology from inside the family. He described Helen's patterns of manipulation, the carefulness with which she directed Mark's public-facing narrative, and her disdain for consequences when they served a purpose. He was reluctant, often asked that his testimony be handled carefully, citing family threats. Commander Miller arranged for a safety plan. We filed motions for witness protection where necessary. I do not understate the cost to him. He took a step that could cost him family or even physical safety, but he took it. With Albert's cooperation, detectives reopened the file on Ray Harrison's death. Ray had died years earlier, classified then as a probable accidental overdose that left questions but no charges. The reopened investigation found anomalies: prescription records that did not reconcile with hospital logs, an initial timeline that conflicted with witness statements, and a last-minute repair invoice for the Harrison estate that suggested someone had been on site the night of Ray's death. The most harrowing piece of corroboration came when a retired nurse, identified through a thread in the anonymous files, came forward. She had worked at the small clinic where Ray had been treated in his final hours. Her memory was fogged, but a few details stood out. An entry in the chart that listed a medication given at an unusual hour, and a note that a family member insisted records be checked before filing. She had told herself at the time that her recollection was shaped by the stress of a confusing night. Now, with the recordings and Albert's account, the note was reinterpreted. When detectives sought a warrant to search the Harrison estate, they did so on the narrow grounds of fraud against Ray's medical record and potential tampering with evidence. The search yielded a small, hidden drawer of documents that matched the letters in the anonymous box. A careful search of Helen's personal devices, done pursuant to warrants and with legal counsel present, yielded messages that suggested a pattern of concealment. All of this moved slowly, but when it moved with weight. The state charged Helen Harrison with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The mere filing of those charges sent a new tremor through the social landscape the Harrisons had curated. Meanwhile, Mark's separate criminal case proceeded on the immediate proximate acts: assault, threats, and property destruction. The initial arrest had been a necessary immediate restraint. The subsequent, more formal charging followed months of investigation and depositions. Mark's defense strategy leaned on public persona. He presented character witnesses, highlighted volunteer work, and attacked the credibility of Ariana's contemporaneous notes as selective memory. His team also tried to suppress the recordings from the anonymous package, arguing inadmissibility, but the court, after an evidentiary hearing, ruled that the recordings, authenticated by forensic analysis and corroborated by Albert and other contemporaneous documents, could be admitted under the party admission exception and as evidence of intent and pattern. That hearing, more than any public pronouncement, signaled a shift. When a judge allows previously hidden recordings into the record, it changes the tenor of a case from contested narratives to contested facts. Trials are strange spaces. They are formal, ritualized, and designed to contain the mess of life in strict rules of relevancy and procedure. Yet they are also the place where human unpredictability can rewrite legal scripts. Mark's trial came first. I watched Ariana take the stand with a steadiness I half expected to be carved out of granite. She described the slaps, the isolation measures, the PR campaign that had followed. She described Helen's applause that night as if she were placing a stone on a map, one clear landmark in a landscape of smaller humiliations. The defense attempted to paint Ariana as inconsistent, an accusation my adversaries used often. For people who look only at headlines, memory appears as a sieve, inconsistent to the extent that we are human. But memory, when recorded and cross-referenced with texts, emails, and the police call on speaker, becomes a latticework of corroboration. We played the recording of Helen's applause for the jury. We introduced texts from Mark that were controlling to their core, messages that asked for location checks and offered helpful suggestions that were anything but. We produced testimony from friends who had observed Ariana's retreat from social life and from a psychologist who, without offering pathologizing labels, explained how coercive control operates in patterns. Mark's counsel fought fiercely. They called character witnesses and tried to minimize the non-physical occurrences. They argued, predictably, that temper flares happen in marriage, that context matters, that no one could know what had happened behind closed doors. But with the recordings and Albert's corroboration of Helen's pattern of narrative control, the jury's vision shifted. When the verdict came, it was not the kind of catharsis you see in films. It was a formal pronouncement, guilty on counts of assault and threats, lesser convictions as to property destruction. The sentence: years in a state facility, regulated probation, restitution ordered for property damages, was significant enough to remove him from Ariana's day-to-day and to mark a civic judgment. It was also, in the context of our jurisdiction's sentencing norms, proportional to the evidence presented. I will not pretend the outcome erased the months of fear and expense or the small humiliations the Harrisons had inflicted. It did, however, reorient the immediate danger away from Ariana and toward a paper trail that would be hard to erase. Helen's case unfolded like a different, older grief. The prosecuting team presented the recordings, the medical inconsistencies, and Albert's testimony to a grand jury before indicting. At the trial, the audio forensic expert described the methods used to authenticate voice prints, to check for splicing, and to analyze background noises consistent with the settings suggested in the anonymous files. The defense argued that the recordings were selectively edited and that the prosecution's conspiracy theory ignored other plausible explanations. These are the motions that color trials. Each side paints a different picture, and the jury decides which palette holds. One cross-examination stands out. Helen, on the stand, was not the elegantly performative woman I had seen clapping at the dinner. She was smaller in that glass box of a courtroom, and the bravado had left her like a garment shed in haste. The prosecutor had a line of questions that, at first, seemed to scratch at the surface. Whose idea was it to misfile the record? Who called the nurse to the house that night? Why were certain notes altered? The questions, precise and clinical, were designed to compress years into choices made in the now. At a certain point, Helen's voice broke. She shifted in her seat and said, in a way that the court reporter recorded and we all heard, "We thought it would save him. It was never supposed to be like this. He was so fragile. We couldn't let his life be ruined by Ray's presence." The words were not a clean confession in the sense the movies give. They were a saturated mix of rationalization and admission. The jury read that moment with the same human hunger we all have for accountability. The verdict in Helen's case returned as guilty on charges of murder and obstruction. She was sentenced to a long term in the state's correctional system with additional findings regarding her role in obstructing the original investigation. The sentence was not and could not be framed as a restoration for Ray or closure for anyone. It was a civic accounting, a judgment that the state would punish a criminal act according to law. These convictions had ripple effects. The Harrisons' PR firm folded its relationship with them and lost other clients who did not want association. Magazine pieces were retracted or rewritten with apologies for not checking sources. One of the most profound shifts in the months after the convictions was the letters we received from people, strangers, who had watched the case with a new language of recognition. Women wrote about the small things they had dismissed, comments about what to wear, the joke that becomes habit. Men wrote apologizing for having missed their partner's warning signs. Survivors told us that seeing the recordings had made them brave enough to document their own abuse, to seek orders of protection, to call their local hotlines. That, perhaps more than the courtroom pronouncements, felt like the work that mattered most. Ariana began to rebuild in very practical ways. She moved into a small, sunlit apartment across town, a place with a balcony where she grows herbs. Daniel, a kind man from her office who had been gentle and patient through the trial, helped her assemble IKEA furniture and coaxed her into finding joy in small rituals. They dated carefully, with mutual respect and the quiet consent of someone who has watched a loved one endure a public storm. Ariana's new job offered remote hours at first, then more responsibility as she proved her capacity to lead without sacrificing safety. She applied for a fellowship in a research institute and received it, the kind of professional validation that has a particular sweetness after your name has been attacked. We developed rituals that were not legal at all. On Sundays, we cooked something elaborate and deliberately messy, pasta that spilled like confetti, because perfection had been weaponized against us. We visited Robert's grave a few times a year and left notes. I went back to court in the weeks that followed to teach seminars about coercive control and the evidentiary value of contemporaneous records. It was strange to be both a public educator and a person still working through loss, but it felt necessary. If the story of our case could help one person notice a pattern earlier, it would be worth the fatigue. There were practical restitutions. Mark's employment terminated as a result of his convictions. He lost certain certifications required for his pay grade position. Helen's social standing evaporated. These losses were not celebratory for me. They were consequences of a legal system engaging with wrongdoing. The Harrisons' assets were not seized as recompense to us. Any civil judgments were painstakingly extracted through the slow machinery of collection. I do not ask you to imagine that justice arrived in tidy packages. It arrived in the awkward, bureaucratic ways that institutions have: verdicts, paperwork, supervised visits, registry entries. One particular hearing I remember vividly was the mitigation hearing before sentencing. The judge spoke of harm and culpability and the paradox of punishment. Punishment does not heal the injured. It marks, in the public ledger, a moral wrong recognized by the state. That framing stayed with me. Our drive was never retribution. We sought safety, accountability, and the prevention of future harm. Those aims are not identical to the rhetoric of a social media feed that wants catharsis. They are quiet and persistent. There were other institutional consequences. Reporter retractions and reformations in editorial practices followed as a few outlets reviewed how they had handled the initial Harrison-friendly stories. A local philanthropic board implemented more rigorous conflict of interest checks after internal pressure from members who feared association with unexamined donors. These were small reforms, but real. They are the kind of incremental change that makes social institutions marginally more transparent. The anonymous package and Albert's testimony did not protect us from critique. Some said we had relied on dirty evidence and suggested the ends justified the means. We pushed back and always were careful to emphasize the legal steps we took. We turned the materials over to police rather than publishing them online. We sought authentication. We accepted the scrutiny that came with relying on anonymous sources. That restraint mattered in court and in conscience. Over the next year, I wrote op-eds and spoke at a few bar associations and community centers about the limits of protection and the need for practical habit building, contemplatorist notes, safety planning, and the usefulness of quiet record keeping. When I spoke, people often asked the same question: how did you know when to keep pushing? There is no single answer. There is a mix of maternal instinct, professional judgment, and the slow accrual of danger. Sometimes you keep pushing because the cost of silence is too great. Sometimes you accept temporary withdrawal. Every choice in these situations carries risk. A few months after the trials, I received a letter from a woman in a small town who explained that reading about Helen's applause had made her realize that what she had been told to take in the name of family was actually coercion. She had reached out to her local shelter and filed for an order of protection. She wrote simply, "Thank you for making me name it." That letter sat in a drawer near my desk for months. It was a small reward, but it felt like the right one. We did not walk into some rosy, restored life. The wounds left scars, emotional, financial, relational. There were friends we had lost. There were awkward reunions when people wanted to move on without acknowledging the harm. But there was also growth. Ariana began to lead a small peer support group for young women in her field who had experienced harassment or control. She did not brand herself as a martyr. She simply created a space where people could share the small erosion points that, if ignored, become fulcrums for great harm. Lucy returned to her special brand of organizational genius and helped me restructure my practice with clearer boundaries. I scaled back hours at my firm to write and to speak, to create a more sustainable life that did not make my presence a constant litigation posture. I began, slowly, to use my voice in a different way, to teach lawyers how to navigate the line between advocacy and exploitation of personal relationships. There is a hunger in our profession for that kind of ethics conversation. It is one of the few silver linings in the aftermath. One of the final acts in our public chapter was a small kennel convened by a regional law school. We invited Commander Miller, a survivor who wished to be anonymous, but whose voice we recorded with consent, and a forensic audio analyst to speak about cross-discipline cooperation, how police, lawyers, and forensic experts can collaborate to ensure that evidence is both legally and ethically handled. At the event, students asked questions about the limits of anonymous tips, about journalistic ethics when encountering leaked material, and about the psychological toll on families caught in the spotlight. The conversation felt, for the first time in a long while, like we were building infrastructure that could prevent future cases from becoming what ours had been. In the quieter moments, I returned to old rituals. Robert's picture sits on a mantel in our living room. Sometimes I make his roast and feel both ridiculous and comforted. On one particularly clear afternoon, Ariana and I went to the pier where we used to watch foxes cross the marsh. She was wrapped in a scarf bought with the first bonus from her new job. We spoke about nothing and about everything: small triumphs, the odd cruelty of memory, the way kindness accrues when you least expect it. She told me, haltingly, that she had been working on a project about chemical safety that made her feel purposeful again. She had a calmness now that had been practiced like a muscle. There were also small public acts of atonement. Some of the people who had once stood with the Harrisons issued statements of regret for having believed an unvetted narrative. Others reached out privately to apologize. These gestures did not erase anything, but they acknowledged the human capacity to be misled and the obligation to do better. In time, I began to write the book that would become both catharsis and public service, a memoir that told our story alongside practical advice about building records, recognizing patterns, and navigating the system. I did not write as someone seeking revenge. I wrote as someone trying to give people the tools we had used, tools of law and of simple record keeping, to better protect themselves. The book, when it was finally published, did not sell like fiction. It sold to people who needed to know that someone else had walked this path and lived to tell it. We also established, quietly and without fanfare, a small fund at a local shelter to help pay for legal fees for people seeking orders of protection. It was not a large endowment. Our resources had been strained by litigation and counter-litigation, but it was practical and specific. Help paying filing fees, a grant to cover an emergency hotel night, vouchers for professional counseling. We set it up with clear guidelines and open audits. We wanted to ensure that the Harrisons' use of money to influence narrative did not leave others without access to the basic tools of safety. When people ask what exact moment I felt free, I always struggle to give a neat point. Liberation was not a single event. It was a slow tapestry of removed obstacles. The day Ariana moved into her apartment and placed a tiny plant on the sill. The morning a jury found Mark guilty. The afternoon the audio reports authenticated the voices that had once been secret. The afternoon Helen finally sat without an audience, and the consequences of her actions were reflected back to her. Freedom was more a process than a door. If you listen to the arc of our story, you will notice 3 things that made a practical difference. First, contemporaneous records, phone calls, texts, photos, are anchors. They are not dramatic, but they are convincing. Second, institutional patience, a police commander who listened and a prosecutorial team that would accept difficult evidence matters. Third, community, friends, colleagues, and strangers who offered small, concrete support makes endurance possible. I do not tell this story to suggest that institutions are perfect. Far from it. There were moments when the law felt hollow and when social networks did exactly what power networks do. They bend the reality you inhabit to favor the privileged. I tell it because it is, at one particular intersection, the story of how careful documentation, courage from unexpected witnesses, and persistent legal work can carve out a path through a dense thicket. The final scene I will leave you with is not a courtroom. It is a warm afternoon at the cemetery where Robert is buried. Ariana and I sat on the bench near his stone. We brought a thermos of coffee and a small tart. The air smelled of cut grass and late summer. We spoke about the absurdity of how small cruelties can become huge if left unexamined. Ariana said, "I used to think love must hurt sometimes. Now I know that was nonsense." "True love never hurts," I told her, not as sermon, but as stubborn truth. It holds you, it doesn't make you smaller. She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, the smile was free of calculation. There is no clean ending to a story like ours. There are ongoing hearings in separate civil matters, conversations with therapists about boundaries, nights when the past intrudes, and nights when it doesn't. But there is also a new architecture to our lives, known limits, protective rituals, community ties, and a willingness to tell the story so others don't have to learn it the hard way. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you name a memory or notice a pattern, know that you are not alone. There are resources and people who can help. If you found this message useful, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Help others know that silence is optional and that careful documentation, trusted allies, and the instruments of law can, with imperfect beauty, protect and restore. Thank you for listening to our story. If you are in immediate danger, please reach out to your local emergency services or a local domestic violence hotline. Reach out to someone you trust, and if possible, create a discreet safety plan. You deserve safety, dignity, and to be believed.